The topic that we will discuss next is the endgames with the isolated queen pawn. And this is a very common topic in chess in general, because especially in the middle game, the isolated queen pawn is such a common pawn structure that can arise from many different openings, whether it's e4, d4, or c4, that one needs to know at least the very basics of how to handle these pawn structures. And our focus here will be the isolated queen pawn in the endgame. More specifically, the strategies to use, how to fight against this pawn, or more precisely, if you remember this topic of two weaknesses. Well, the isolated pawn is clearly one potential weakness for your opponent, but very often you need to create the second one, whether it's on the queen side or on the king side. And so we will see some good examples in which top players have managed to do that. So I would like to start with an analysis of one opening variation in the Semi-Slav that I have done maybe a year ago or so, which basically directly goes from the opening to the endgame, where black has the isolated queen pawn. So this is not so uncommon that some opening variations reach the endgame almost by force, and that's why it's really important to know the right ideas, because if you get into this position and you just kind of shuffle the pieces around, you will not achieve anything. The isolated queen pawn is a super solid pawn structure, and you really need to be skillful to exploit this slight structural weakness. So let's see this variation. It comes from the Semi-Slav, and more precisely from the anti-Maran variation here with queen c2. And here normal move is bishop d6, it's the most common one. There are other moves like b6, bishop e7, and somewhat rarely, but still it's quite a viable idea, black plays the move a6. Now the idea here, by the way, it should not be confused with a6 on move here, on move 5, that's a different line. So here, a6, black's idea is the following. After white develops his pieces, like this, black will first castle, and on the next move he will push e5. And the point of this was, after he pushes e5, with which he gains space in the center, the point of the move a6 was that white does not have this maneuver with knight to b5. In this line, for example, it's not really working, but if the bishop was on e2, in that case it would have been good for white to go knight b5. And here white should take, of course, and we get this position with the isolated queen pawn. Now we know that the side with isolated queen pawn should keep more pieces on the board, and so if white would castle now, we would have a middle game where black would definitely gain some active play on the king side with his bishops on c8 and e5, and also, you know, with moves like knight g4 and queen coming, it could lead to an attack for black. So here, instead of castling, the best move is actually in line with white's general plan in such positions, which is to trade off pieces and control the square in front of the isolated pawn. So knight e2, we want to exchange the strong bishop on e5 and control the d4 square. And now variation goes like this: queen a5, bishop c3. This leads to an exchange. In case of queen a3, there could be b4, so no big difference. So there is an exchange. Okay, here if black had just the rook on d8 and push d4, then this would be completely equal. However, white can, in case of let's say rook d8, white can go knight e2 back and put his knight on d4, block the isolated queen's pawn. So here white has a small but lasting advantage. And black needs to play precisely not to get into a very passive position. So let's see, here we have several continuations, several games that are quite instructive for this type of position. First of all, where to develop black bishop. It looks very sensible to develop it to e6 to protect this pawn. However, it's not the best square for the bishop. We will see in a little bit why this is so. The best development for the bishop is on d7. But let's see if black goes to e6. So now we have something like rook c1. And here I have two examples. One started with rook fd8, the other one with rook ac8. So let's see this one with rook d8. So black wants to go d4. Of course, white will put the knight on d4. Definitely we can exchange a pair of rooks. f3 is a useful move to stop any knight e4. And also this move prepares g4 expansion on the king side. We know that from previous chapter that we need to create the second weakness, and this is exactly why we play g4 and h4 and so on. By the way, the weakness of e3 pawn now, it's not really important because I will put my king on d2. Okay, black also centralizes his king, that's logical. And now g4. So this was all played in the game Jakubowski against Ali Marandi. This is a grandmaster and the future grandmaster. Now black plays knight d7. Obviously wants to bring his knight to e5. And white just continues with his expansion. He plays h4, trying to create a certain weakness in black's position. So black will have to either push h6 or g6. He decides to push the g-pawn. And here white has several good ways to continue. I mean, he could try to open the h-file with h5, or he could fix the h7 weakness with g5, maybe later also f4. But he plays an interesting move, I think, rook b1. So he switches his focus to the queen side, trying to create a weakness on that side as well. He's probably happy with his accomplishments on the king side because all of these pawns are on the light squares, which is good news for white. And now let's see. With rook b1 he's preparing to push the pawns to b4 and a5. And after white pawn is on a5, then when white pushes b5 there will be no a5 from black. So let's see how it continues. a4. Yes, this pawn goes to a5. And here black played a fairly logical move, knight c6, trying to exchange this strong centralized knight. Now, how to exchange the knight? Well, the best is to just take on c6. If we allow black to take on d4, then there will be no more isolated pawn. So we take, rook takes is forced, otherwise if he takes with the pawn there will be bishop takes a6. And as we said, white pushes his pawns like this. Now white has complete domination here and black has to play really carefully now. But his continuation, I'm not sure if it's the best. He went for the rook endgame, like this, played bishop c6. In case of bishop taking, we get a rook endgame which is very unpleasant for black. Maybe it is just lost, because his rook is passive and on the next move I'll play rook b6 and then king d4. And this really looks bad for black. So here he played bishop c6, but this did not help him. Now he's forced to take with the pawn. and after the move rook b7, black is in trouble. So white finally created or managed to target one of black's weaknesses, the f7 pawn. Also he has the passed a pawn, and the problem for black is that the pawn endgame here is lost, like this, c5. And how does white win now? Well, he can create another passed pawn with e4. It's not good for black to take this pawn, obviously, because then king c4 comes. So he has a pair of connected pawns, and here we just create a passed pawn like this. And we do the breakthrough with f6, and white gets the new queen. So this is kind of a textbook win from this position after rook c7. Instead of that, black player went for this a pawn, but he's losing both of his pawns on the 7th rank, and now also g6 is weak. And his last chance to save the game perhaps was king e6 to try to protect the g6 pawn. So in this case, at least he's not losing another pawn. However, he gave a check and was hoping to use the activity of his king. Why did white king go down? Why he didn't go to the 3rd rank? Well, ideally he would like to, but then there would be a lot of checks from the side. So he played king e1. It's still good because we win the g6 pawn. And this is of course a winning position because white has too many pawns. Black cannot really create any dangerous passed pawn, and so white won the game in a few more moves. So this was a very convincing example of play against the isolated pawn. First we have blocked it, then we created some potential weaknesses on the king side, and after that we switched our focus on the queen side, where eventually white managed to open it up with the a5 and b5 and target the weakness on b7. Alright, so now let's come to see another example in a similar position. From here we saw rook fd8, there is also rook ac8. And here, okay, white uses the same setup basically, like this. But it's important to know that here you don't trade, you need to have one rook. It's not good to trade another rook because then you don't have a potential attacking piece, right? So let's keep this rook. Anyway, black's control of the c file is irrelevant. He doesn't have any penetration squares there. So the normal move, this was played in the game Kuzubov against Saleh, and the player with white is a very strong Ukrainian GM, so his play here is also quite instructive. Here actually I forgot to mention in the previous example, there is the move h5 that stops g4. But we will see in one more example why this move can be risky as well. Well, in that case, white can play h4 and push b4 and continue with the plan that we have seen. But let's see what happens here. King f8, g4. And this example is slightly different because here black did not play g6 or move his knight, but he played g5. And this move is bad. This plays into white's hands because it weakens the f5 square and also helps him to just open up the h file. And this is exactly what happened here. So white now took control of f5 square. He can put either the bishop or the knight there. The h6 pawn is weak, and white can open the h file at will. b4 it's a very common and useful move in such structures, stopping black from playing a5. So here he finally decided to put the bishop there. So there could be an exchange of bishops followed by knight f5. So black returned to e6. Okay, white maneuvered a little bit. And finally he decided to open up the file. Now when the knight has gone from f6, there is rook h5, attacking this pawn, and after f6 he traded this bishop so that he can put his own bishop on f5, and basically here there is no way for black really to protect the f6 pawn. And white won the pawn on the next move. So this is a very convincing victory for white, but also here black made a bunch of unforced errors in a way, because a move like g5 is completely unforced and it's just creating more weaknesses. So this is a general advice in endgames: don't stay away from such moves, don't make weaknesses yourself. And also later he didn't handle this position in the best way. So this is what happens in case of bishop e6. This is not the best square for the bishop. It should come to d7, and the reason is that the e6 square should be reserved for black knight. Because what will happen is that white will bring his knight to e2, we will see shortly. So here we have one more example where black has actually played h5 move, stopping g4. I should also mention, by the way, that there was a high-level game here between Leko and Chinese player Ni Hua. And here Ni Hua managed to hold the draw quite convincingly by using this maneuver that I said. Excuse me. So he brought the knight to e6, his king to d6, and he pushed the a5 pawn. This is the ideal setup for black. But actually in the game that we will see between Russian Grandmaster Gunina and another international master from Russia, black played a similar plan. So he played h5, stopping g4, and he brought his king to the center. Now, one thing I wanted to say about this h5 is that a plus for white can be that this pawn is on the light square, which can mean that later it could become a target. But okay, let's see what happened here. So the knight came to d4 as usual. Okay, black put all his pawns on the light squares, and the typical b4. So it stops a5, and also sometimes there is the move like rook c5 or knight b3, knight c5. And now black completed this maneuver, which is the best thing he can do in this position. So knight comes to e6. And here we had the trade of both rooks. As I said, if you allow this exchange on d4, then there is no more isolated pawn, and here black can even play something like this: bishop b5 followed by rook c4, and it's totally fine. So here white is forced to trade both rooks, which kind of decreases his winning chances, but on the other hand he still has something to play for here. And here white played king c3, intending to bring his king to d4 in case of exchange. So we have a problem of exchange. Should black trade the knights or not? He should not, because the endgame that will happen here, in the game actually he made this mistake, but this endgame is very difficult. We have seen in previous video games of Kasimdzhanov, one game of Kasimdzhanov where he had exactly similar advantage. All of opponent's pawns were on the color of his bishop, and we made the conclusion that these endgames are difficult, if not lost by default. Also the conclusion we made was that the side who has such structure that violates Capablanca's rule should keep more pieces on the board, and therefore for black it was the best to keep this knight. Now there is no king d4, and okay, we would still continue the maneuvering, but with increased chances for a draw. However, as it is, this probably leads to lost position for black. And let's see how white maneuvered here to provoke weaknesses. So there is the isolated pawn weakness, but let's create a new one. Where would that be? Well, if you remember, I said that h5 could be a potential target, and this is exactly what happened. Gunina played a strong move bishop e2, intending to push g4, and after that we can create either a pass pawn or a weakness on h5. Black can stop it with f5, but that creates new weaknesses, right? The g6 pawn is weak, and for instance here white has this nice maneuver of the bishop to this side of the board. And now after this we will get a position similar to the game where black will soon get into zugzwang. So this was not really good. On the other hand, bishop e6, g4, we create a pass pawn. And yeah, if he plays bishop d7, then we can maneuver a little bit more and you know, bring our bishop to f3, and then he has two weaknesses, but basically he'll get into zugzwang soon. So let's just quickly see what happened in the game. There was f6 and bishop d1. This move is now a very nice tactical perception by white player, because just a move ago this plan of bringing the bishop to b3 was not as effective, because when the pawn is on f7, black can play bishop e6 without any fear. Well, let's see what happens here. Now when bishop comes to e6, at some point it will have to move to f7, and then it will not be defended. And if it goes to c6, then white can proceed with his plan, because now bishop on d7 doesn't control g4, and h5 would become a weakness as well. So in the game this happened, and then white played the slow move a3, but basically he wants to force black bishop to move to a passive square like f7, from where it will be not be defended. And black just played like this, but white is just waiting for black to run out of the pawn moves. You see, he's just moving back and forth. And now let's say if the bishop moves to g8 or f7, we have e4. The bishop is not defended. So that's very good perception by white, that after f6 this bishop is not protected anymore. So black played f5 at least to stop e4, but the problem is that now he's putting another pawn on the light square, and white is just biding his time. Okay, now after a4 there is no more bishop b3, but that's a fourth pawn on the light square, and that's bad news for black, because the chances for him getting into zugzwang are huge. Now there was bishop a6, okay, kind of looking what black will do. But finally the bishop comes to the right diagonal, from where it will attack the h5 pawn. And here black is running out of good moves. If he plays king e6, then he cannot protect both of these pawns. Played b5, but there are 5 pawns on the light squares, so, and I can attack 4 of them, so this is really an easy zugzwang now. Bishop comes here, keeping an eye on b5. He has to move his bishop. If he moves to d7, there could be bishop. Is it bishop g2? Let's see. If bishop d7. Oh, bishop d3 puts him in zugzwang immediately, because f5 and b5. And if bishop c6, bishop g2. Now he cannot prevent bishop f3 winning the h5 pawn, or otherwise he would lose the d5 pawn. So this is a textbook example of how to use this advantage of your opponent's pawns on the same color as the bishop. But the starting point was probably this mistake here. Remember that it's not good to go into this type of endgame. If you're a weaker side, you should keep more pieces on the board. So this was a brief discussion of this theoretical line in the Semi-Slav that where you get the isolated queen's pawn right out of the opening. From a very similar line, we have a recent game of Anish Giri against Mamedyarov. Although in this line something has went wrong for black because his development is much worse compared to the previous line. And white has a huge advantage here. Giri noticed the right motive. It is the c7 square, which is completely available to white pieces. And now black is faced with a difficult defense. But Mamedyarov kept on fighting, so played rook d8, and then he will bring his king. And he will play also knight e8 to kick out the rook, but rook has an excellent square on c5. Playing b6 for black creates further weaknesses, then rook c6 comes. So he just continued by king f8, intending to put the king on d6 and then to play bishop d7, rook c8 and trade a pair of rooks. In that case, we would get a very similar position to the one we've seen in Gunina's game. And here, white has to act quite decisively before his advantage evaporates. And so the start is good. G4, as we know, it's a good move. Here h6 was played. And now, how should white continue? Unfortunately for Giri, he made just one inaccuracy. Here he played kind of a straightforward move, but not the one that puts the most pressure on his opponent. So he played the move f3, which doesn't really look like it has a specific purpose here, because g4 was played, and e4 is not under attack, so it's kind of a very slow move. He had the better choice. He should have played like this, h3 first, to support the pawn. And now, let's say if black plays king e7, as he intended to, we play f4. Now this move is much more active, and here after king d6, we attack the pawn, and we are basically not giving him any time to develop, because now we can play rook c7. The point of f4 was that now there is no bishop e6 because of f5. This is why we played this active move. And here after rook c7, f7 pawn is under attack, and it doesn't really look like black can develop successfully. There's too much pressure on his position. And I'm sure that Giri would have won this position right here if he found f4. Otherwise, let's say if he plays bishop e6 immediately, we said f4 comes, and knight f6, okay, threatens knight e4, so bishop f3, bishop comes to d7. But the thing here is that even if black manages to trade a pair of rooks, his king is now too far. And I will bring my knight to c3 and king to d4. Even if black brings his king to d6, he cannot play bishop e6 because we said f4 is a strong idea to play f5, to kick out the bishop from e6. So it was only this small inaccuracy, not playing the f4 move, that cost Giri the victory in this game, I believe. Because look, he played f3 and h3, and then he changed his mind. He realized that f4 is actually the right idea, but it was a bit too late, because black is just in time to complete his development here. If g5, there will be takes and knight e4. If rook c7, I simply play like this, and again there is no improvement for white here. Next move is rook dc8. So if g5, this is even not better for white anymore, because black is now becoming active. with his bishop. So b4 was another option, but again rook c8 and b6 forces a trade of all pieces, with quite a solid position for black. White is still better, but this is not what nearly as good for white as it was earlier. So Giri decided to play the move that gives him the most pressure, but now his pawn structure has been compromised. Well, the idea was to force this exchange so there is no rook c8, but black can simply play rook d7, stopping rook c7, and yeah, after that black was fine. Basically, now white is forced to trade a pair of rooks, and there is nothing here for white. Black is covering all his weaknesses well, and in a few moves draw was agreed. So there is one more important strategy here you should try to remember, is that sometimes you can play this, especially if black is very passive, you can play this move f4. It's gaining space, stops bishop e6, and also prepares a move like bishop f3 when it's very difficult for black to defend the d5 pawn. So in this video we have looked at this very common type of position where opponent has a bad bishop. In the next video we will look at isolated queen's pawn positions where it's more of a fight with the queens and knights, and we will see 2 games of 11 Aronian with white pieces.